Shalom, I'm Chaim Topol. Usually I'm involved in the cinema and the theater. But like every other Israeli, I'm called as a reservist for several weeks every year to serve with the defense forces. My job is to meet guests from abroad, to take them around the country, and try and help them understand Israel's security problems. Here is a good place to start. It's called Amirim. It's in the Galilee, in the northern part of Israel. And from here, if you look down there, you can see the Lake of Galilee, above it the Golan Heights and the Syrian border. Now, if you turn and look over there, you can see the Mediterranean. It means that this is the entire width of our country. It's only about 40 miles from the Syrian border in the east to the Mediterranean in the west. In military terms, it means having no strategic depth, nowhere to fall back to in case of a surprise attack against us. An invading force could cut the country in two in a matter of hours. Along the Mediterranean coast, in a very narrow strip, 65% of Israel's entire population is concentrated, as well as 80% of our industry. As you can see, we are so small and our resources are so concentrated that we are extremely vulnerable to any attack. We are a country under constant threat. Our right to exist is still challenged by all but one of our Arab neighbors. Our survival from day to day depends upon constant alertness, efficient early warning, and a realistic assessment of the threat around us. We have to move and counter-move, adjust, check and maneuver, as daily we watch the factors of a delicate equation slipping further and further out of balance. We are in one of the nerve centers of the Israeli Defense Forces. Here, intelligence information is collected from all over the Middle East. It is carefully assessed. Even the smallest details are analyzed by experts. Major General Ehud Barak is the Deputy Chief of Staff.
We suffered a major failure of the early warning system in the 73 war. We do not believe that the surprise will come the same way. We clearly know that the Arabs, especially the Syrians, might try to find a way to repeat this type of surprise, even with better accomplishments. And we are fully aware and carefully scrutinize the horizon day by day and hour by hour to avoid this from happening.
The Middle East, Israel on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, a country of only 4 million people surrounded by 22 Arab countries and Islamic fundamentalist Iran. It is a region of confusion, of conflict and of shifting alliances between Arab countries. Oil has brought great wealth to many of them. Lack of oil means poverty and discontent to others. Many countries are tied to the past, and religious extremism is a potent force at work. The Middle East is a competitive arena for the superpowers who play for vast stakes in this crucial area. So these are the shifting sands upon which the strategic equation is written. But there was a moment when the whole world hoped for peace in the Middle East. In November 1977, an event occurred at Israel's Ben Gurion airport, which offered an escape from this cycle of violence. President Anwar Sadat, who had led his Egyptian armies against Israel only 4 years earlier, arrived here, this time as peacemaker.
ولقد جئت إليكم اليوم على قدمين ثابتتين.
I come to you today on solid ground to shape a new life, to establish peace. What is peace for Israel? It means that Israel live in the region with her Arab neighbors in security and safety. To such logic, I say yes.
There was Camp David, a peace treaty, and then in Washington a famous three-way handshake, which became a symbol of hope for a comprehensive peace.
Let us have three of us together.
The Israeli-Egyptian accord has held firm in the face of much hostility. Syria and Libya led the countries which rejected the peace process. And the wheel of Middle East violence continued to turn. Sadat was dead, and Hosni Mubarak carried on the peace with Israel. But still, ripples of terrorism spread through the Middle East and far beyond. We have witnessed an appalling toll over the past 10 years. State-sponsored terrorism, holy revolution, and all-out war. We are surrounded by violence. Some of it defies Western logic, and much of it has nothing directly to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict. But we must watch and assess all the activity in the region as it affects the strategic equation and therefore our security. As we are in an information center, in order to try and understand what is really a complicated picture of the Middle East, let's have a look at some of the countries of the region individually so we can see what's been happening there in the last few years. Let's start, say, with Saudi Arabia. Can you bring it up, please?
The West continues to maintain the belief that Saudi Arabia is a moderate, stabilizing influence in the Middle East. In fact, the Saudi contribution to stability has been minimal. Internally, there are enormous tensions created by its super oil wealth and the over-rapid modernization of a traditional society. Unbelievably, the recent drop in oil prices has led to balance of payments problems in a country whose princes are used to limitless spending.
In the eyes of the world, Saudi Arabia has stayed out of the front line of confrontation with Israel. The reality is that Saudi oil wealth is used to buy vast armories for other Arab states and terrorist groups like the PLO. In spite of the drop in oil revenue, Saudi Arabia continues its own military buildup at massive levels. In the past 4 years alone, over $70 billion have been spent to acquire the most sophisticated weapons available today.
Under the Ayatollah Khomeini, Iran was whipped into a fervor of fundamentalism and became a center of religious revolution. In September 1980, Iran's sworn enemy, President Saddam Hussein of Iraq, launched an attack which led to all-out war with casualties of well over 1 million and the cost of more than $130 billion.
The war broke all international conventions. Civilian populations were targeted. particularly by the Iraqis, in what became known as the War of the Cities. Some 200 missiles were fired indiscriminately at ranges of 600 kilometers and more into the cities of Tehran and Qom, leading to thousands of civilian casualties and creating widespread panic.
The world was shocked even more by the open use of chemical weapons, and not only in the battlefield. Civilian populations were also targets for gas attacks. In the Kurdish village of Halabsha, it was claimed that more than 4,000 people were killed. Countries hostile to Israel have therefore shown they have no moral restraint in the use of such weapons. So, chemical warheads and long-range missiles have become a factor which Israel has now built into its deterrence strategy.
The war brought wider implications for Israel. Iraq's stock of tanks was doubled. Its tank transporters increased 10 times. Its combat-experienced troops increased from 12 to over 40 divisions. In the future, Iraq might consider sending expeditionary forces against Israel rather than see the release of tens of thousands of men to a civilian future of unemployment, creating internal unrest.
Iran is expected to continue its policy of spreading the tide of fundamentalism, a constantly fermenting factor in the strategic equation.
Egypt established a peace with Israel in spite of much opposition from the Arab world. President Mubarak has now succeeded in re-establishing ties with most of the Arab states, and the peace has been maintained. He can now redirect his resources to deal with Egypt's economic problems, its overpopulation, unemployment among its urban youth, and the ever-present problems of fundamentalism.
Soviet-backed Libya is an Islamic state of the masses. It ignores the conventions of statehood. Its embassies abroad are bases for Gaddafi's assassination squads. Its armies have been active abroad, in Chad and Uganda.
Libya actively sponsors terrorism and provides shelter for a wide range of terrorist groups. An American strike in retaliation received only qualified international support. Many European countries rely on Libya for oil and fear Libyan terror.
Libya is an arsenal of top-line Soviet weaponry with 3,000 tanks, over 600 combat aircraft, missiles, and a growing naval fleet. All this exceeds its military requirements, manpower, and operational capabilities. The Libyans can readily supply these armaments to any Arab country which opens hostilities against Israel, as they have supplied Syria in the past.
On our eastern border, the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. King Hussein is an absolute monarch. He is a minority ruler in a country where over 60% of the population is Palestinian. He survives because of a highly developed intelligence network, a fiercely loyal Bedouin army, and his own ability to maneuver in the Arab world.
His search for approval from the radical states makes any possibility of peace with Israel difficult to achieve. His up-and-down relationship with Yasser Arafat is an example of this. He has expelled the PLO only to welcome them back and then expel them again. Another inconsistency. He recently made a surprise visit to Damascus to re-establish contact with President Assad of Syria, his longtime enemy. This followed 50 years of conflict over the Hashemite right to rule, and there were border clashes as recently as 1980. The possibility of military cooperation between Syria and Jordan must be monitored carefully by Israel. The two countries directly dominate Israel's borders.
Now Syria, which we have watched over recent years with increasing alarm. In fact, Syria is now the greatest and most immediate threat to Israel.
Syria actually uses the military and terrorist options to further state policy and sponsors terror worldwide. Since Hafez al-Assad took power in 1970, he has used brutality and repression to deal with any opposition.
In February 1982, he pulverized the town of Hama in order to crush a Muslim opposition group. Over 10,000 civilians were killed.
Syria plays a dominant role in the affairs of neighboring Lebanon and its warring factions. Lebanese leaders beat a regular path to Damascus, mindful of Syrian-inspired assassinations of their predecessors.
Syria maintains a permanent military presence in Lebanon, a country which itself is in a continuous state of civil war. Syria sponsors terrorist groups operating from there against Israel.
Syria is a bastion of Soviet influence, with over 2,000 Russian advisors assisting the army. Assad has been building and upgrading his forces on an enormous scale. His stated objective to be able to attack Israel successfully without the need for any other Arab support.
I take Hafiz Assad and his regime seriously. I take them by their own words. They have been explaining all along that strategic parity is designed to create a situation in which they go to war against Israel, and they mince no words in explaining what they seek to achieve by that war. They have not been explaining that they want strategic parity in order to make peace or to have a settlement in the region.
So this Syrian push to achieve military equality with Israel is clearly a particular concern to us. The head of Israel's Air Force is General Avihu Bin-Nun.
By getting all those weapons, new weapons, qualitative weaponry, they believe they'll have the edge because if we talk about quantities, they are already passing Israel in quantities in the air, in the land, and in the sea. The quantities of airplanes for fighters today, for instance, in Syria, they have about 650 fighters, which is more than the RAF.
When we look at Syria, they are supplying fully by the Russians. They have supplied them with the most advanced versions of the surface-to-air missiles, the SA-6 and the SA-5, which is maybe Syria and Libya are the only places on Earth outside the Soviet Union and its satellites where this type of weapon system is deployed with a range of 250 kilometers or 150 miles. It covers even the areas over this operations room and over Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and etc.
So this is the neighborhood in which we live, some of the background and some recent events which seem relevant to us. Now we must examine a factor which, when added to these political instabilities, throws our strategic equation completely out of balance.
In recent years, the Middle East has been the center of an unprecedented arms race. It has sprung directly from the Arab oil wealth and purchasing power.
Western countries have for years been pouring in billions of petrodollars. To recover them, to get them back into their own struggling economies, they are selling tanks, aircraft, missiles, anything they can to the Arabs.
The quantities are vast, and the Middle East is now one of the world's biggest arms markets. Competition between arms producers is fierce, and where once it was dominated by Eastern Bloc countries, today, because of the petrodollars recycling, the West is the major supplier, its motives political as well as commercial.
The Tornado deal has no strings attached. Unlike the agreement with the Americans, which restricts US-supplied aircraft to the south of the country, the Tornadoes can be based close to Israel. As a result, Israel has protested that the deal is going to upset the balance of power in the Middle East.
It is an illusion to believe that these accumulation of modern weapon systems serve as a stabilizing element.
There is no way of guaranteeing that weapons bought for fighting domestic or other regional enemies and armies developed for the same purpose will not be turned against Israel at some point. And Israel, in calculating the Middle Eastern military balance, has to take that into account.
We can look at the number of missiles that Saudi Arabia is buying. If you take the number of, let's say, Sidewinder missiles or Maverick missiles that they've bought in the last several years from the United States, and you calculate how many sorties would they have to fly with the number of airplanes that they have or intend to buy, you'll find out that it's impossible, even in 5 wars, to use all those missiles or weapons.
This is the level of imbalance Israel faces when you combine the forces of Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. Manpower 4-1, artillery 7-1, tanks 3-1, and combat aircraft over 2-1. These countries in turn can seek support from the entire Arab League. The total stockpile of arms bought by Arab countries has cost $150 billion.
The Arab countries are not only buying weapons in vast quantity, but of super quality from East and West. The Soviet equipment they are receiving is also state-of-the-art.
In the past, Israel has taken comfort from its technological edge. Recent Arab purchases have clearly reduced this safety margin. Arab armies are now highly mobile and have great offensive potential. Arms trends are towards greater range, accuracy, and destructive power.
A new phase in the arms race, long-range surface-to-surface missiles. The Saudis have Chinese strategic missiles, range 2,500 kilometers. The Syrians have Soviet-supplied Scud-B and SS-21s. Chemical warheads now in production in Syria can be fitted. And Israel's population centers are directly threatened.
A special threat is the purchase of control, communication, and intelligence-gathering equipment, mainly from the West. 5 AWACS are operating from Saudi Arabia. They could supply battle intelligence to Arab armies from such long ranges that they need never appear to be directly involved in a war. This fighter control could mean an Arab airstrike potential, which would cover the whole of Israel.
We are in Tel Aviv. Imagine an aircraft taking off from Damascus in the north or from Mafraq Air Base in Jordan in the east. Minutes flying time from Israel's border. Until it reaches our border, it's anyone's guess whether that aircraft is on a routine mission, on a training flight, or whether it's hostile. We cannot react. But once it crosses our border, a countdown begins. In less than 60 seconds, the capital, Jerusalem, is under attack. 40 seconds later, Ben Gurion Airport, our lifeline with the outside world. In less than 4 minutes, Tel Aviv, the coastline. These are the hair-trigger margins with which we live. But air attack is only part of our problem. This is where we are exposed to the greatest danger, a frontline position in the Golan Heights. This is an Israeli lookout post on the border with Syria, eyeball to eyeball, with a neighbor actively preparing to overrun us. This is where the lack of strategic balance is suddenly very real. You're not just talking statistics, you feel that the margins of defense are very narrow indeed. I'm visiting this post with Brigadier General Yossi Ben Hanan.
This area looks rather quiet, almost pastoral today, but unfortunately I can assure you that a kilometer behind us, in bunkers, in camps, in trenches, over 2,000 tanks out of artillery pieces, infantry, anti-tank capability, crossing equipment, all ready to attack westward, and in a matter of a very short notice. Since it is a standing regular army, they can jump on those tanks and attack, and this plateau will be filled with fire and smoke, and a very limited number of standing regular army units of ours will try to stop this surprise attack, if it happens, and wait until our main bulk of the reserve units will be mobilized and come to reinforce the defensive line. So I would say that the main daily defensive dilemma of the IDF in the Golan Heights is how to decide what will be the number of regular standing army units that we have to deploy here in order to deal with the first attack, with the initial surprise attack, and how we can guarantee the reinforcement of these very small regular army units by the reserve components. This is the daily dilemma of the defense of the Golan Heights.
So how do we keep some sort of balance in the strategic equation? How do we maintain our deterrence? Well, our strategic ties with the United States are very important, but it is up to us to ensure early warning, to update our weapon systems, and keep our forces at a high level of combat readiness. This is a combined arms exercise for reservists who make up 2/3 of Israel's defense forces. Unlike the Arabs, Israel cannot afford to maintain huge standing armies. In addition to 3 years of national service, we all give up at least another 4 years of our life to the reserve. A few weeks each year, right up to the age of 54, we have to leave our farms, factories, and offices with great disruption to business, career, and family life. Efficiency of mobilization is paramount. The reserves have to be transported from their homes to any battlefront very quickly indeed. The difficulty is knowing when to mobilize, when the threat is real. Israel cannot afford to finance a response to false alarm after false alarm. The edge of deterrence has always been Israel's key defense. It has produced specialized weapons like the Merkava tank, designed for the regional terrain and developed to protect its crews and to transport troops under cover. Israel is highly sensitive to loss of life. Everyone has a brother, a son, a cousin, or a boyfriend in service. Casualties are felt very deeply throughout the community. The question on everyone's mind is not whether we will win. We have got to win, but at what cost of human lives? This issue does not seem to overly concern Arab military planners, as the Iran-Iraq war again clearly demonstrates. Israel's chief of staff is Lieutenant General Dan Shomron. He has been active in the Middle East's military environment for over 30 years, and he believes that Israel has an advantage which offsets Arab supremacy of armament, manpower, and territory.
היתרון היחסי שיש לנו במשוואה האסטרטגי הוא כולו במישור של האיכות האנושית של האדם.
The relative advantage we have in the strategic equation is entirely in the human factor, the quality of our people. Our officers and soldiers are raised in a democratic and open society. They are trained to think, accept responsibility, and take the initiative. Our society is also technologically developed, so our men are capable of exploiting the full potential of our weaponry, even to invent weapons. They come up with surprises all the time in the course of battle. If you combine all of these factors with our advanced weaponry, our small and highly qualified army can overcome much larger armies equipped with massive amounts of arms. Naturally, we would prefer to prevent war by sheer deterrence, and we hope we'll never need to prove yet again that although we are small, we still have the edge in war.
We've looked at some of the threats building up around us, and we are left with a lot of questions we keep asking ourselves while we live our daily lives. How do we maintain the strength to dissuade Arab countries from hostilities or all out war against us, and simultaneously keep building our civilian industries, our agriculture? How do we keep constantly alert and have enough early warning to mobilize our reserves against an attack and still not disrupt too much our people's careers, businesses, and education? And while building our country, how do we gain time to find overall answers which could fulfill the hopes we all had on that day in March 1979?